The media would like to forget it. Joe Biden certainly would like to forget it. But the story about Hunter Biden's corruption in Ukraine and China and elsewhere is not going anywhere. What you're about to see is my interview with 6-time New York Times best-selling author Peter Schweizer. He's the president of the Government Accountability Institute. He has been covering the Biden family extensively, long before most people were paying attention to this at all. It is a very fascinating conversation. It's a timely conversation heading into inauguration month in just a bit here. Hunter Biden is back in the news because he's under a federal investigation. We now know the media has suddenly decided to cover this again for tax evasion. I talked to Peter about that. I talked to Peter about all kinds of things as it relates to the entire Biden family's evidence of corruption. And we actually go beyond just the evidence. We go into what we actually already know. In fact, my first question, just to cue it up here, my first question to Peter is, well, we're having this conversation in the context of an investigation. That kind of implies there's still so much more to know. And there is. But what we don't want to imply is that it's all just still an open question. It's not. We know for sure Hunter Biden has been involved in some corrupt dealings in Ukraine and in China. Peter has reported on it, and he has researched it. My first question to him that you're about to see is exactly that. Peter, what do we already know about Hunter Biden's corruption? With that, make sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned for a really fascinating conversation with Peter Schweizer. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor at The Federalist, and make sure you like and subscribe while you're here and stay tuned for a truly fascinating conversation with Peter Schweizer.
Embedded in your question, I think, is a really, really important nugget. And that is, as Michael Kinsley, the writer, once said, some of the most corrupt things in Washington are also the most legal. So there's a question of laws being broken, which of course is very, very important, but there's a lot of things that go on in Washington that are highly corrupt, would not be tolerated in the private sector, but because the political class gets to write their own rules, they aren't necessarily illegal. So in the case of the Bidens, what you have is a situation where Hunter Biden has enriched himself, and I would argue has enriched the broader family, by virtue of the fact that his father was in positions of power. And what that means essentially is that his father was a powerful senator. He was vice president of the United States. And in that capacity, Hunter Biden cashed in. And he cashed in by getting lucrative deals with foreign oligarchs and even foreign governments like the Chinese government. And these are, jobs or deals that he brought nothing literally to the table. He had no expertise. He had no background. He wasn't bringing any capital to the table. The only relationship he was bringing to the table was the fact that his father was a very powerful figure. So you have obviously the deal with Burisma involving Ukraine, a natural gas energy company. Hunter Biden had no background in natural gas. This company's paying him $1 million a year. And the question I've always asked is, what were they getting in return? They weren't getting expertise in return. So what were they getting in return? In the case of China, it's a little bit more complicated, but I would argue even more troubling, which is when Joe Biden was vice president of the United States, Barack Obama appointed him the point person on U.S. policy towards China. And literally within a year, Hunter Biden had secured a series of deals that were very lucrative, very secretive, that again, he had no qualifications to get. He became a partner, a member of the board of directors, an equity investor in a Chinese entity called BHR, Bohai Harvest, RST. It's a private equity firm funded completely by the Chinese government, not by a Chinese bank, not by an American company, but by the Chinese government. He has an equity stake in that company, estimated to be maybe $30 to $50 million. He has no background in private equity. He has no background in China. He did a series of other deals with the Chinese as well. And then you've got the collection of others, Kazakhstan, Romania, where he was looking to do other deals. So we still don't know the full constellation of what Hunter Biden was doing.
So you just mentioned Kazakhstan and Romania, and to a lot of people, that probably sounds like new information. And I think that's partially because the saga of Hunter Biden is so incredibly convoluted. He has his hands in so many different fields. Can you
Yeah.
talk a bit about what we know in terms of Kazakhstan and Romania?
Yeah, we don't know a lot. We do know that there was a Romanian oligarch that was up on corruption charges and that had hired several people in the West, including Hunter Biden, to sort of help him get out of the fix because he was not allowed to travel to the United States. He was subject to certain criminal sanctions. The estimates are based on the emails coming out that he was getting paid as much as $60,000 a month to Hunter Biden, who again has no background in criminal law, in Department of Justice matters. He's being paid because his father is vice president of the United States. When it comes to Kazakhstan, it appears that Burisma, the Ukrainian energy company, was trying to do deals in Kazakhstan, and that Hunter Biden's business partner, Devin Archer, was actually closely wedded to the Kazakh Sovereign Wealth Fund. This is the government fund that corrupt government funds. His business partner, Devin Archer, of course, didn't really have background in private equity either, and that business partner is now headed to jail because of his involvement in Indian bond scheme, fraud scheme that took place. So this is now, I believe, the third Hunter Biden business partner who is going to the big house. So it's quite an interesting collection.
Yeah, and it's, people always say where there's smoke, there's fire, but it does seem that we already know in terms of Hunter Biden that the fire was there. He was involved in all of these different things where, we know what he was getting paid. We know with whom he was dealing in terms of like these oligarchs. And this federal investigation is why he's back in the news. So I wanted to ask you if you could break down what the federal investigation is probing. It's a tax evasion case, which is obviously a little bit different than some of the things we talk about when it comes to Hunter Biden. But what are they looking at right now?
That's a great question. So, it's very interesting. We first started reporting on this back in January of 2018. I didn't know it at the time. We know now that later in 2018, they actually convened a federal grand jury in Delaware to look into Hunter Biden. Based on the reporting that's out there, I have to say I don't have any, back channel communication with anybody involved in the investigation. But based on the reporting, it started looking at matters involving, counterintelligence, public corruption. It's looking at money laundering. The attention right now is dealing with taxes and the avoidance of taxes. I don't believe that's where this begins and ends. I think this is sort of the camel nose under the tent. Because if you go and investigate tax law, and that becomes sort of the tip of the spear in your investigation, because the U.S. government has tax treaties with countries around the world, if it's a tax case, you now have the ability to access financial records, foreign banking records, et cetera, around the world. So my theory is that they are looking at taxes first because it's going to allow them to collect a lot more information, and then we'll see what the grand jury has to say as it relates to these other issues. Money laundering is certainly a concern here as well. We know from the Senate report from Senator Ron Johnson and Senator Grassley's committee that Hunter Biden, when he was taking in this foreign cash from Chinese and Ukrainian and other entities, when that money was being wired into his accounts, it was triggering so-called SARS reports with the Treasury Department. And these are suspicious activity reports. That's what a SAR report is. And what that means is that there are large sums of money coming from sketchy actors into politically connected entities in the United States. That would certainly fit the definition of what Hunter Biden was doing. So the reason that's important is that SARS oftentimes can lead to investigations involving money laundering because they're trying to figure out why is the money being sent, what it's connected to, is this the ultimate destination, or is the money going somewhere else? So I think right now it's being looked at as a tax investigation, but there's lots of evidence that it's much more broad than that. And I think that the tax case as I said, is the sort of camel's nose under the tent that allows them to get access to a whole lot of financial information involving the Biden family overseas.
This might be an obvious question, but are there reasons, corrupt reasons, that he was evading tax law in the first place? What are the possibilities in terms of why he is now under investigation for tax evasion, in terms of why he was doing what he was doing, allegedly?
No, that's a great question. I mean, yes, it's very possible that he didn't want to disclose the sources of income. Again, I mean, if you're dealing with Burisma, which is this corrupt Ukrainian company, the owner of that company was under serious investigation by the Serious Fraud Office in the UK, by the FBI in the United States, involving all kinds of things from bribery, links to organized crime, et cetera. You had money flowing into Hunter Biden involving Yelena Baturina, who is a Russian oligarch who our State Department, under the Obama administration, linked to one of the most notorious Russian organized crime gang families. You can go and read about it in the WikiLeaks cables. So, if you're getting cash transfers from individuals like that, you may want to try to hide it and not want to disclose it to the IRS, because it's basically an admission of who you're doing business deals with. We only know about the Baturina stuff because one of Hunter Biden's previous business partners, Bevan Cooney, agreed to share 26,000 emails with us. And in that tranche of emails, we saw the relationship with Yelena Baturina. So you raise a very, very good point. Sometimes you're avoiding disclosing sources of income because you're just trying to avoid paying taxes. Another reason that you might do so is you don't want people, particularly the government, particularly the IRS, to know who's actually paying you gobs of money.
This is a perfect segue into the next question that I wanted to ask you is, we know the people that Hunter Biden was doing business with in China, in Ukraine, and in some of these other places. We know who they are. We know what they're like. We know what their interests are. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, what we know, the people we know he was interacting with in China, for instance, CCP affiliated folks, and the people affiliated with Burisma and the Ukrainian government. I'm curious as to what you can tell us in terms of who he was openly doing the business with, and we know about it.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I think a really important point that I point out over and over again. I mean, look, Hunter Biden is not an international businessman who is going to London and Tokyo, and sitting down and talking with legitimate actors. I mean, he was going to China and Ukraine, which by any measure, including Transparency International, based out of Switzerland, are, really the two most corrupt places to do business in the world, other than, say, Zimbabwe or a few other entities. So the point is, I mean, these are the sort of outer fringes of respectable capitalism. So in the case of China, Bohai Harvest, that's a private equity firm where he was put on the board of directors. He has an equity stake. That is fully funded by the Chinese government. Again, not by a Chinese bank, not by an American bank. It's literally the Chinese government putting investment dollars in there. So his business partner is the Chinese government, which considers itself our chief rival on the global stage, which has an agenda to challenge U.S. naval supremacy by 2030, which by 2049 wants to surpass the United States in economic might and technological prowess. So that's troubling. But there are other Chinese partners as well. I mean, he had a real estate company he was connected with, Rosemont Real Estate. They were taken over, purchased outright by a Chinese company called Gemini. Well, who is Gemini? Gemini is linked to the People's Liberation Army Navy, which is the Chinese Navy, which again is trying to challenge our supremacy. So you have a military or government relationship there. And then finally, you have CEFC, which is this Chinese energy company This is the one that has raised a lot of questions as it relates to Tony Bobolinsky and the deals they were trying to do there. But CEFC was linked to the Chinese military. The top executives were actually arrested on bribery charges and convicted by the FBI, a guy named Patrick Ho. And when Patrick Ho was arrested by our FBI, one of the first 2 calls that he made when he was in FBI custody, one of those calls was to the Biden family. He called James Biden looking for Hunter Biden. So these are the sorts of people they're dealing with in China. Obviously, as we talked about in Burisma, you have a highly corrupt company. There's been a lot of good reporting by John Solomon recently that indicates that our State Department, our Department of Justice, recognized Burisma as being very corrupt from the beginning. So the bottom line is, he is not dealing with, legitimate, trusted Western companies in his international dealings. He's dealing with foreign governments that have a strategy and a goal of surpassing the United States, and with corrupt oligarchs that have long, long rap sheets of doing all kinds of corrupt behavior. These are the people that the Bidens have chosen to do deals with on the global stage.
And that should really be the bottom line, I think. It's amazing how you'll still get these headlines like Hunter Biden did nothing wrong. I remember Anderson Cooper said something about that in a debate. Joe Biden at one point said, there's no evidence of any wrongdoing on your son's part. But it's not a matter of just evidence. It's like the facts are plain as day. Bohai Harvest is such a great example that any company that's affiliated with the government in China is essentially an arm of the CCP, right?
Yeah, exactly. And to underline that even further, I talk about this in my books. So Hunter Biden is on the board of directors of Bohai Harvest, this private equity firm, which is funded by the Chinese government. Look at the deals they do. They're in the habit of acquiring companies overseas. Well, they acquire an American machine tool company called Henniges. They create anti-vibration technologies in Michigan. What does Henniges do? They create dual-use technologies that have military application. Mm-hmm. So you have the son of the sitting vice president who's on the board of directors of a company acquiring an American dual-use technology company. Who does his firm acquire Henniges with? That would be with the Chinese Aviation Corporation, which is the largest military contractor in China. So, it's not only that Hunter Biden's making money, they are doing deals, and there are many others. They are doing deals that are advancing the state interests of China. And for Anderson Cooper or these other commentators to make these ridiculous statements, it would be like saying, back in the day, I do business with Al Capone, but it's legitimate. I didn't do anything wrong. Well, who are you doing business with? And why did you, Hunter Biden, get these deals with the Chinese government only 9 months after your father was appointed point person on China? And the fact that you have no experience, you bring nothing to the table for these people. It's an absurd position that Anderson Cooper and others have staked out. And by the way, it's not a position that they apply to other politicians in Washington, certainly not the Trumps and certainly not Republicans.
There is an amusing piece in New York Magazine by Jonathan Chait that says the Trumps basically, the entire Trump ally campaign, everyone who's in favor of Trump is wrong to kind of do a victory lap and spike the football on their media criticism from before the election when people were blacking out the New York Post story, because this tax investigation doesn't vindicate anybody's concerns about the hard drive in that New York Post report. So I'm wondering how would you describe the connection between this tax investigation and what the media was trying to silence in the days leading up to the presidential election?
Yeah, no, it's remarkable because what you had is a situation before the election in November in which the media not only didn't cover the story, but later on in the New York Times, Ben Smith actually applauds the fact that they killed this story. So it's a complete and utter and total lack of curiosity. that's so shocking here. I mean, I go back to the early days of the Russia investigation involving Trump. I mean, when the initial reports came out, I was like, hey, we got to see what's there. We should have an independent counsel look into it. We now know that it was really, fictitious. I mean, there was nothing to this story. But the point is, you should at least be curious and want to look. And the problem with all these reporters is none of them actually ever looked. So you had the Washington Post, which did a fact check on some of the claims that I had made. And of course, President Trump had made some statements about it. And sometimes what President Trump, states about the relationships with China of the Biden family doesn't completely align with the way we reported it. But what happened was the Washington Post fact checked it and said it's fake. Well, what did they do? Their source was Hunter Biden's lawyer. He was the source for the fact check. And now, of course, it turns out that lawyer lied repeatedly. I mean, Hunter Biden told ABC News, I haven't made a single penny from China. Well, we now know that CEFC alone, the wire transfers came out from the Senate committee. There was $5 million wire cash transfer to him. So, I mean, he didn't get a penny from the Chinese. He got millions of dollars from the Chinese. Same thing with Joe Biden. Joe Biden on the debate stage where Donald Trump said, my family hasn't made money from China. The only one on this podium that's made money from China is, Donald Trump. Again, that's a flat out lie. I'm old enough to remember when journalists used to be insulted when politicians lied at them and wanted to get back at them. I mean, back in the day, this is before your time, I have to say, Emily, but there was a candidate named Gary Hart who was running for president in 1984 against Walter Mondale. And Gary Hart told the media, blank-faced, I do not cheat on my wife. I do not have extramarital relations, period. So what did the intrepid reporters do? They said, we don't believe you. They followed him, and they proved that he was lying. The media of today has no interest in doing that. And this is a far, far, far more important story than what Gary Hart was doing in 1984. But they just simply do not have curiosity about any of these things. They make up their mind already that it's a non-story without having actually researched it. And they take the word of Hunter Biden's lawyer to, quote unquote, discredit the story.
The Gary Hart example is an instructive one because it seems that they just don't have the same disdain for elected officials that journalists used to have. And that was such a part of the journalistic attitude, is that you were inherently skeptical of any elite or of any elected official, and you had disdain for the power that they wielded in the way that they often wielded it. And now it seems as though journalists, they want to take a selfie with Joe Biden.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, what's the old journalistic statement? Speak truth to power. Well, now it's speak truth to power sometimes, kind of. I mean, that's the new motto that they have. And that's where I think if you look at a lot of the opinion polls, and of course, polling doesn't do so great these days, but I think this one is true. I mean, the belief in confidence in the major media outlets in the United States today, in some polls, are below that of Congress. And Congress is in the basement. So it tells you the distrust that people have for media. And part of it is this. I mean, my view has always been, I'm politically conservative, but I have always said they need to have scrutiny for Donald Trump. There was some very, very good reporting on Donald Trump as it related to issues of conflict of interest, et cetera. And that reporting needs to take place. I mean, some of the reporting, of course, on Russia collusion was wildly inaccurate. But my point is that needs to take place. The problem is they only want to do it for certain candidates and for certain political views. And people see that. People see what they say on Twitter. They see that they dismiss things, immediately. And even now, rather than saying, maybe there is something to this Hunter Biden case, maybe we need to have a deeper exploration of Biden family details because Hunter Biden is under investigation by this grand jury. And the other brother, the brother, James Biden, is also under FBI scrutiny for his involvement in this company in Pennsylvania. Maybe we ought to dig deeper. That's not their reaction. Their reaction is to try to kill the story, immediately, which is just outrageous.
Yeah, it's remarkable to think about. And one of the greatest things about your reporting is that it is the opposite of what we were just discussing. It goes to people who are on both sides of the aisle, and it will look into them. And that said, there is, like you mentioned, some reporting about the Trump family's dealings in China that people on the left mostly have drawn parallels to what uh,
Right.
Biden was doing in China. Do those parallels exist? And what do we know about Trump? I think it's the Trump organization, his dealings in China as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, first of all, absolutely, it's a legitimate story because whoever is president of the United States, you want to know what financial connections exist. And in the case of the Trumps, you have um, ties that have included Jared Kushner, who had real estate deals where they would find Chinese investors, and you have these EB-5 visas that people can get if they invest in creating jobs in the United States. So he was a beneficiary of that. You had Ivanka Trump, who had a clothing line, including a shoe line. Much of her production took place in China. But what I would say is it's a story. It needs to be reported. People need to know about it. But to me, it's vastly different than what you're dealing with the Bidens. Really for a couple of reasons. First of all, these were all businesses, whether it was Kushner's real estate work or Ivanka Trump's clothing line, happened way before Donald Trump was even a candidate for president of the United States. The point being is these were actually businesses that were set up in the marketplace and were going to rise and fall based on whether they performed or not. So, Ivanka, had a fashion line and she did manufacturing in China. That's very different because what you have with the Bidens, and I ask this question all the time, what do the Bidens actually produce? What is Hunter Biden bringing to the table? He's being paid. So what is he being paid to do? You have Ivanka Trump is selling shoes. You have Jared Kushner, who's involved in commercial real estate, whatever. Hunter Biden didn't have any of that. He's a fixer. It's an influence game. The currency that they're selling is influence. That is vastly different. So I would put Donald Trump's commercial ties with China in the same category I would put, say, Michael Bloomberg's, which is they are a legitimate story. People absolutely need to know about them, but they are vastly different because they are actually legitimate businesses. I would argue that what the Bidens have done in China, what they do in Ukraine, it's not legitimate business work because it has nothing to do with selling a product or providing a service. It has everything to do with political connections. And I've seen journalists equate the two. These journalists are not that dumb. They know the difference between the two, but they're trying to blur it in a sense to try to protect Joe Biden.
Right. And the product really is Joe Biden. The product selling is access to Joe Biden himself. Another great thing about your reporting is that it's been on the entire Biden family. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what we know about James Biden, who is Joe Biden's brother and is also implicated in some access peddling.
Yeah, we in my book I refer to them as the Biden Five. It's not the Jackson Five; they're not as talented, but they are the Biden Five because you have Hunter, who of course we've talked about. You have James Biden. James Biden is involved in all kinds of activities, some of which are now under FBI scrutiny. He was also the beneficiary of Iraqi war contracts, Iraqi reconstruction contracts that occurred in 2010 through 2012. Joe Biden was in charge of Iraqi reconstruction at the time. James Biden was the executive vice president of a newly formed construction company. And James Biden has no background in construction, by the way. And they got billion-dollar contracts from the Obama-Biden administration to build houses in Iraq. All kinds of questions about that. But then you, of course, have Frank Biden. This is Joe Biden's other brother, who was doing deals with the Costa Rican government while Joe Biden was vice president of the United States. And he was involved in deals that got taxpayer-funded loans from the United States government, the Obama-Biden administration, to do renewable energy projects in Costa Rica. Again, Frank Biden has no background in renewable energy. Then you can look at his sister, Valerie. This is Joe Biden's sister, Valerie, who has managed Joe Biden's political campaigns over the years. has been paid millions of dollars to do so, which certainly seems self-dealing. And then finally, you could look at Ashley Biden, his daughter, who is married to a guy named Howard Krein. Krein started a business that is called Healthcare Startup, which was literally launched from the Oval Office in the Obama-Biden administration. And Ashley Biden, Joe Biden's daughter, explains, her husband explains how he called Joe Biden, and Joe Biden set up a meeting with Barack Obama and got them meetings at the highest levels of the federal government as it relates to healthcare data, even though Ashley Biden's husband's company was new and didn't even really have a website at the time. So this is the way the Bidens have operated. They've done it for decades. They did it when he was in the Senate. They've done it while he's vice president, and they are going to continue to do so, when he's president of the United States.
And that brings me to the million-dollar question here, which is how does all of this reflect on the president-elect, on Joe Biden himself? What's your take on that? There's a great documentary that's based on your reporting, Riding the Dragon, you collaborated with Blaze TV on that, and you talk about how Hunter Biden is having meetings in China during a trip to Beijing that he took on Air Force Two with his father.
Yeah, exactly. They are completely intertwined. I mean, this $1.5 billion private equity deal that Hunter Biden was involved in was secured 10 days after Hunter Biden visited Beijing, China, with his father traveling on Air Force Two as part of the official delegation. So these are all intertwined, and the Bidens are not going to change a thing because they haven't faced any consequences for this behavior. Joe Biden made a statement, shortly after the election. He was asked about his family's business dealings, and he said, "Well, my family is not going to do anything that poses a conflict of interest or is going to reflect badly on the United States." And you think, okay, this is great. They're changing things. Here's the problem. He thinks all the previous deals meet that criteria, because he has always said there's nothing inappropriate was done. There's nothing to see here. So the bottom line is we can expect more of these kinds of deals going forward. I think they're going to be more covert about them. But as it relates to China, this to me is the big, big problem. Joe Biden has always minimized the Chinese threat. He continues to minimize the Chinese threat. Even if the rhetoric sounds a little bit stronger, you still have the fundamental fact that the president of the United States family has received millions of dollars from Chinese state-owned entities. They are our chief rival, and we are expecting him to stand up to them. And I think that is a hard thing to expect, because you not only have the fact that there's this sense that they've made his family wealthy, but you also have the very real fact that they may have compromising information relating to those deals that they could use as leverage against a President Biden.
You just answered my last question, which was going to be, what is the danger of all of this? We know that it's hypocritical. We know that it's duplicitous. We know all of that. But you've reported on this over the years, be it the Clinton family, the Bush family, now the Biden family. And I think it's so helpful to think about how Biden may be compromised by his family's relationships with members of the CCP and with the Chinese government. At the end of the day, what is the cost to the United States of elite corruption at some of the highest levels, beyond just the hypocrisy and the duplicitousness?
No, it's a great question. I mean, I believe the old saying by Richard Weaver that ideas have consequences. I also believe money has consequences. I mean, think about how much reporting, and I think it's legitimate reporting, has been done over the years, looking at, Wall Street money, flowing into campaigns, big oil putting money into campaigns, big tech putting money into campaigns, big labor putting money into campaigns. Follow the money is an adage in Washington, D.C. that makes sense because that's how the city functions. Well, all of those examples we just talked about, we're talking about instances where, powerful institutions or entities are giving money to help get candidates elected, and that those entities have a seat at the table and have influence on those political figures. How much more is somebody going to have in terms of influence and leverage if they didn't contribute to get somebody elected, but they made the politician's family rich. I would argue they're going to have far, far, far more leverage, especially if we're not talking about a domestic industry. We're not talking about an oil company in Houston. We're not talking about a tech firm in Silicon Valley. We're talking about a foreign government, China, which sees themselves as our chief rival and wants to supplant us. Of course, they're going to use their leverage. And there's history here. People that are, seriously studying China and their strategies have seen this played out in Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, where the Chinese Communist Party has adopted a strategy where they essentially want to buy off and co-opt the political class. So rather than try to, influence elections like they did back in 1996 with the Clinton campaign and elicit, let's just forge commercial ties with the political elite, and we will basically neuter them. We will decapitate these foreign countries by neutering their leadership. That's the danger, and that's where I think we are with a Biden administration.
It's kind of chilling to think about.
Yeah. It is. It's very disconcerting.
Yes. Peter, thank you so much for your time this morning.
It's great to see you, Emily, and great to be on with you. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Peter Schweizer. He's the president of the Government Accountability Institute. He's also 6 times New York Times best-selling author. You can and should and must follow him on Twitter and follow his reporting as much as you possibly can. You have been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.